Welcome to Bible study. Today we are studying Acts chapter 16. This is for St. Michael's Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon, and I'm preparing this study for February 25th, 2024. We've been living in the world of Acts for some time now, but indeed, arguably, we're kind of getting to the point now. And these are the missionary journeys of Paul. We've already seen one. He's gone on the brief journey into the southeast corner of Asia Minor. But really, that journey was into the environs of the city of Antioch. These are the areas that are really falling within the orbit of that great eastern city on the east end of the Mediterranean. And so far, we have really been pretty localized with this. Word of it has gotten back to Jerusalem. There's been a bit of a kerfuffle about how the Gentiles should be received, but for the most part, it's been a fairly small-scale event. With this second missionary journey, in which Paul and Barnabas split, Barnabas goes to Cyprus. Paul is going to go back to the areas near his hometown where they had their first missionary journey to encourage the brothers, is what he says. That's initially the task that they have in mind, but it very quickly expands. In fact, the encouragement of the brothers merits only a couple of lines. What Luke is going to describe here is the Christian movement moving into the cultural centers of the Roman Empire and making enormous strides toward reaching the power center of the Roman Empire, and that is the city of Rome itself. This second missionary journey has some of the most familiar stories we have of Paul's missionary enterprise. His conversion of the Philippian jailer, of Lydia, we're going to hear about that one today. His sermon on Mars Hill, his experience in Thessalonica and the Bereans who were of a better character. Those stories are where we're at, and these oftentimes form, even for us today, what is the heart and the core of the Acts message after the Pentecost event. And we believe it was that way for the first readers too. Luke has been building to this. Much of the material we've been reading in terms of Peter's interaction with Cornelius and the Jerusalem Council and the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch have all been preparing us for this explosion of missionary activity that we're going to see in chapters 15, 16, 17, and really to the end of the book. Let's get into this. Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra. These are the two of the cities where he had been preaching on the first missionary journey with Barnabas. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And this is one of the things that oftentimes I think we lose sight of, that in fact the Jewish-Gentile division was not nearly as sharp as people imagine it to be. There were many of these homes that lived in both worlds. It's fascinating that if you look at Jewish people within a century or so of their arrival, they start to look a lot like the locals. He was well spoken of by his brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So they're bringing this letter with them that the apostles in Jerusalem had written, that James in chapter 15 had commissioned. And so the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. That's all that initial purpose gets here. There's no more. But there's no more. But we do get this strange incident where, 'cause 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 we do get Paul has Timothy circumcised, and this seems to be really at odds with his vehement opposition to requiring circumcision on the part of anyone in his letter to the Galatians. Now, we have to be a little careful with the letter to the Galatians. We're really not sure when it was written or even who the Galatians are, because that can be an ethnic identity, that can be a geographic identity. There can be people who live in the region of Galatia who are not Galatians, and you can have Galatians that are not living in the region known as Galatia. And so who are these Galatians? We don't know. And we also don't know whether this letter was written very early in Paul's ministry. It could be his very first. Some people believe that it was the very first letter that he wrote. Others contend it was much later. This is a much more mature Paul. We don't know. And so you have to be a little careful in that. But even so, no matter when it was written, the Paul who wrote Galatians doesn't sound like the Paul who would have had Timothy circumcised to appease the people that were doing this. The reconciliation of this may not be entirely plausible or possible for us. But I do think it gives us occasion to be somewhat humble about what we are able to say. Letters are letters. They give us an insight into the thinking of somebody at that moment, but they may not have been written to be the statement that Paul meant for all time. And what's more, pastoral practice and missionary practice in the situation in which you find yourself, sometimes that gets really messy in a hurry. And it's quite plausible and possible that Timothy himself saw the possibility of conflict with this and volunteered to meet the Jewish requirements so that nobody could raise this issue, so that Paul could go on with ministry. He didn't want to get in the way, and so he was willing to do this. But in any event, it's troubling. It causes people who read this to struggle a little bit, because here we have this issue of the letter of Paul, the Paul we know from the letters that he wrote, and what we have is this depiction in the book of Acts that they seem at some points to be a little bit at odds with each other. I think Paul was a very complicated person, and I think to suggest that anybody really understands him now is probably going a little farther than they should. Very quickly, the ministry seems to have expanded beyond Lystra and Derbe and Iconium, those cities of the first missionary journey. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. Now, this is not the continent of Asia. This is the province of Asia, which was a small part of what you know today as Asia Minor, the region that is modern-day Turkey. When they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, which would have been going into the interior of Asia Minor. But the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. He has other things in mind. And so passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas, which is on the coast of Asia Minor, on the Greek side of the coast. So they've come all the way around. They're in the northern west corner of what is today Turkey, close to the city of Istanbul today. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia, identifiable likely because he wore the Macedonian clothing. Many of the tribes or the tribal peoples of that world would have had distinctive dress, and Macedonians would have dressed differently than other people would have. They say that in some villages in the Yucatan that somebody who recognizes them can tell, well, that person is from that village and that person, just by the patterns of the ponchos that they wear. Come over to Macedonia and help us, he says. When Paul had seen this vision. Immediately we sought to go to Macedonia. They would have simply gone down to the port and got onto a boat that was going across the very relatively modest distance between Troas and Macedonia, which was right across the way. Concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. And we remained in the city for some days. Philippi is a fascinating little place. You can still go there today. They've done archaeological work. It was right on the main road that connected the Roman Empire, the Roman capital, and Greece and things all the way into that economic powerhouse that was Asia Minor for the Roman Empire. This was a very important little city for economic reasons, but it was also incredibly important for historic and emotional reasons for the Romans, because we all may know that on the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was stabbed in the Senate, and his murderers attempted to reform the Roman Republic. Caesar's adopted son, a man by the name of Octavian, along with a couple of his friends, formed a coalition to bring to justice the murderers of Julius Caesar. They chased them all over the Mediterranean for a while, but they finally met up with them and the armies. They had each assembled armies. This was a civil war at Actium, which is where Philippi is. In a sense, this city was for the people of Rome their Gettysburg. And what the Romans had done is they had turned it into a colony of Rome. And what that meant for them was that if you were a Roman soldier, you had been promised a plot of land as your pension. And they had run out of land in Italy to give away this way, and so they simply declared some other regions of the Roman Empire to be, well, that's effectively part of Italy now. We can give that away to our soldiers. And this became one of those places, a Roman colony. And so the people who lived in the city of Philippi were legally, in sort of a legal fiction, citizens of the city of Rome. This was a very important thing for people. It also probably gave the whole city a bit of a military cast. If you look at the end of the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians, and I encourage you to go do that, you're going to see him use a lot of military imagery to describe that world, or the approach that the Philippians should have. You know, that we stand firm and our enemy is afraid of us. And it sounds very much like what a centurion in the Roman legions would have used to encourage his troops. Philippi will become a very important place. The letter to the Philippians is written much later in Paul's career when he's imprisoned, but this is his introduction to these people. And so this city and this community of Christians that is going to get formed here will be key to much of what Paul has in mind. They're going to be supporters and really important early witnesses to the Christian movement. So we came to Philippi. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside where we supposed there was a place of prayer. Apparently there was not a Jewish synagogue, or he would have gone there. But the Jewish people, when they didn't have a synagogue handy, would go to the river outside of town and meet there. And we spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods. Purple in the ancient world was incredibly difficult to make and was very expensive. And so she's dealing in luxury goods. She's a Saks Fifth Avenue kind of person. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul, and after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. You may notice here that the pronoun has shifted. Right there, a few verses before what I just read, that it says they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia in verse 6, but then in verse 10, when Paul had seen a vision, immediately we sought to go with him into Macedonia. And from here on out, we're going to have several of these passages that come through here which are written in the first person, using we and us as the pronouns instead of they and them. We don't know whether that is Luke now talking about his time with Paul. We know that Luke spent some time with Paul, but we don't know exactly when he got there. Or it could be that Luke is simply being faithful to one of his sources, and that this source wrote in the first person, and Luke simply maintained that as he incorporated that document into this document, because he told us at the beginning of Luke that he was using other written documents. And so we don't know exactly how to understand the we passages in Acts, but it's really interesting. This is where that transition happens. Lydia encourages them to come to his house, and this is a mark of the early Christian movement. It was almost impossible without wealthy women who opened their homes and made it possible for these missionaries to function, and oftentimes were really the people who opened their doors and they formed the churches of early Christianity, met in their homes. These homes would have been quite large. In the Roman world, you built your house around your yard. Instead of putting your house in the middle of your lot and having a grassy place around it, a yard around your house, you built a wall around your lot, and you started building your house against that wall, and you left your open space on the inside of your house. So the people who would have come to worship in one of these early homes, these house churches, would have been in this large area. It may have been able to accommodate, wealthy person's home like Lydia. Maybe a couple hundred people could have been standing in there. Maybe as many as you think about a typical church, like where I'm standing right now, might have been as large as some of those squares or those plaza-like places were inside those large homes. She urges them to stay. You might say, well, where's Lydia's husband? Marriage in the ancient world was quite complex. It was almost always a economic arrangement. And so her husband may have been traveling. Her husband may have had multiple homes. And she may have, in fact, been the owner of several of those homes, and that she would have had discretion to say, well, come stay in this house of mine. She may not have been living in that house. She may have had 3 or 4 homes around town if she and her husband had been the heirs of several people, or they had inherited multiple homes. But Lydia gives them a place to stay. As we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl, writes Luke, who had a spirit of divination and who brought her owners much gain from fortune-telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And she kept doing this for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, notice it bothers him, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out of her that very hour. No one had asked him for an exorcism at this point. And so he hadn't done it. But finally, pushed, he did. When her owners, this woman was being trafficked, when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, that their cash cow for having this demoniac of a slave was ruined, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. And they're advocating for customs." The crowd joined in attacking them. And the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. When they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them safely. And having received this order, he put them into the inner prison, and he fastened their feet in the stocks. We've talked about this opposition that Paul and Barnabas have. This, of course, we see now is motivated by greed. Luke wants you to see that the people who are opposed to the Christian movement are people who have a vested interest, that opposition isn't purely ideological. It isn't purely that they think their religion is right and this religion is wrong. A lot of times it is because Christianity is freeing people from a bondage that is making other people money. It's probably it's probably not surprising to us then that many of the earliest converts to Christianity were in fact slaves. About midnight, it tells us that Paul and Silas were praying in prison. The prisoners were all listening to them. They were singing hymns. I don't know if they had a mighty fortress yet or not. I don't think so, but they should have. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, and the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened. When the jailer awoke and he saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that everybody had left. They had all escaped. But Paul cried out, "Don't harm yourself, we're all still here." He called for lights and he rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. And when he brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" He's been listening. What must I do? I want some of what you have. They told him. And he took them home, he washed their wounds, cleaned them up, and he was baptized at once, he and all his family. And he brought them up to his house, he put food before them, and rejoiced along with his entire household that believed in God. Now when it was the next day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let the men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul. He said, "You guys can go. They've sent word, you can go." Now Paul plays his trump card. Paul said, "They have beaten us publicly. We were uncondemned. We had no trial. We are Roman citizens. And you have thrown us into prison. And now they want us to run away? They want to throw us out secretly? No, let them come down and take us out themselves." For a Roman citizen, and most of the people in the Roman Empire were not citizens, Paul was. The Roman citizen had special rights, and many of them had just been violated. Remember, this is a Roman colony, and so those rules are really important in this place. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. And so they came and apologized to them and took them out and asked them to leave the city. And so they went out and visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them, and they went on. What adventures! These are the stories that Luke has been just itching to tell us about. He's had to get us ready for it. Here we see Paul really in all his glory, casting out demons, standing up to power, and really reaching out, and you saw in the person of this Lydia, saving people. This is what he's doing. We'll pick up that story next week, but this Sunday, let's get together and talk about these things as you're able. If you have a question about them, send me an email. We'd love to talk more. God be with you.